The Leader of the Opposition.
Go on, Jeremy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Go on, Jeremy.
This year marks two anniversaries. The 70th anniversary of the 1949 Parliament Act, which asserted the primacy of this House over the then hereditary House of Lords. And I think in our deliberations this week it's worth remembering the primacy of the House of Commons over that and over the executive. It's also the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Representation of the People Act, which I remember very well because it extended the vote to everyone over the age of 18. As we meet today, I think, Mr. Speaker, we should commit to strengthening our democracy and the vital role of this democratic House in holding the executive to account. By tradition, at the beginning of each parliamentary session, we commemorate the members of the House we've lost in the last year. Earlier this year, we lost our great friend Paul Flynn, a fiercely independent, passionate, very kind and very principled member of this House. I remember him reading out in this House the names of those who had died in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, two wars which he opposed. He briefly served in our shadow cabinet, and I think the whole House was enlivened by his performance. He joked at the first meeting, both the shadow cabinet and when he spoke from the floor, that there was a part of a job creation, that he was part of a job creation scheme for octogenarians. He wasn't there because he was an excellent orator, campaigner and member of the House as well. He was there because he was an excellent representative of the people of Newport West, the constituency he served so well and so passionately for 32 years. Mr. Speaker, today's proposer and seconder of the Loyal Address share a route to this place. Both were local councillors prior to entering the House. And I pay tribute to all those who put themselves forward to represent local communities as councillors, because without them our democracy would be worse off. They work hard, long hours, and often not particularly well rewarded or appreciated for the work that they do. And I think we should recognise they are part of our democracy. I was a little surprised to see that the member for North East Derbyshire had been asked by the Prime Minister to propose the motion today, because I understand they've not always enjoyed the best of relationships. As we know, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has earned a reputation for enjoying life to the fullest. During his time as London Mayor, I understand he became incandescent with anger and rage on learning that the honourable member, at that time a Westminster councillor, intended introducing a nightlife tax. Thankfully, the member was able to reassure the now Prime Minister that the nightlife tax only applied to car parking charges and not to other activities. Although on reflection he may have missed a great opportunity of earning a great deal of revenue for the people of Westminster. I suspect it's no coincidence that the member for North East Derbyshire has shown great independence of thought as a politician, as he grew up in Chesterfield during the 1980s, a cradle of political dissent. Today, the member is again in danger of finding himself upbraided by the Prime Minister, this time as a member of the nose-ringed, uncooperative Crusties. Indeed, he took his arguments against fracking into the lion's den of the 2018 Tory party conference and predicted that his party's support for fracking would see them lose seats in North East Derbyshire, I assume. My late great friend Tony Benn, the honourable member for Chesterfield, in one of his last books, The Last Diaries, said, the title was Dare to be a Daniel. I hope the honourable member continues to dare, and I hope he will also emulate the daredom, the experience and the wit of his neighbour, my great friend, the member for Bolsover. Yeah. Researching today's seconder, he is my great friend. Researching today's seconder, Researching today's seconder, Mr. Speaker, the member for Truro and Falmouth, I believed I've uncovered yet another secret Conservative project originating in Merton in the 1980s that led directly to Downing Street 3 decades later. Chief of the Wimbledon set, as they became known, was the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. By her side stood her loyal lieutenants, the Honourable Members for Wimbledon, for Basingstoke and, of course, Truro and Falmouth. Today, those are part of the Wimbledon set who are described as competent and professional, which really begs the question, how did the Right Honourable Member for Epsom and Ewell ever sneak into the Wimbledon set? Mr. Speaker, the House may not know this. Most expensive Transport Secretary we've ever had, don't worry about it. Mr. Speaker, the House may not know this, but in 2013, the Honourable Member and I found ourselves in political agreement. I was happy to support her early day motion to mark the anniversary of the death of Emily Wilding Davidson. I think it's worth the House hearing some of EDM 164. The House commemorates the centenary of the death of Emily Davidson, salutes her courage on behalf of the suffragette cause and pays tribute to her and her fellow campaigners for their brave and ultimately successful efforts to secure votes for women. Mr. Speaker, while I may be dubious of the company she speaks, the Honourable Member is more deserving of the honour of seconding today's loyal address. Mr. Speaker, there has never been such a farce as a government with a majority of minus 45 and a 100% record of defeat in the House of Commons, setting out a legislative agenda they know cannot be delivered in this Parliament. And, honourable members, heckles about a general election. I said to the Prime Minister last month, get an extension, take us away from the dangers of a no deal, and then we're in a position to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, we may only be just weeks away from the first Queen's speech of a Labour government. And in that Queen's speech, Labour will put forward the most radical and people-focused programme in modern times. A once-in-a-generation chance to rebuild and transform our country. It will let the people decide on Brexit, build an economy that works for all, rebuild our public services that support everyone, tackle the climate emergency and reset our global role to one based on peace and human rights.
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for giving way. The Prime Minister gave the Right Honourable Gentleman the opportunity of having a general election tomorrow. Had that general election taken place tomorrow, if he'd have been successful, he would have been going to the Council of Ministers this weekend to negotiate. Why did he reject that opportunity when he's been calling for it all the time?
Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, because we don't trust the Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government has had 3.5 years to get Brexit done, and they failed. The only legitimate way to sort Brexit now is to let the people decide with a final say. To pass this House, any deal needs to meet the needs of workers and businesses. That means including a new customs union, a close single market relationship and guarantees of workers' rights, consumer standards and environmental protection. And, if I may say so, guarantees that the Good Friday Agreement will not be damaged or undermined in any way. A withdrawal agreement was announced, but we don't know yet if the government has done a deal. What we are sure of is that this House has legislated against crashing out with no deal, and that the Prime Minister must comply with the law if a deal does not pass this House. The Queen's speech talked about the opportunities that arise from Brexit, but the government's own figures suggest a free trade agreement approach will cause a near 7% hit to our economy, while a no-deal crash-out would cause a 10% hit. These seem like the opportunities that we could all live without. For many people, Mr. Speaker, the economy of this country is fundamentally weak. Since 2010, there are more workers in poverty, more children in poverty, more pensioners in poverty. There are more families without a home to call their own, and more people, fellow citizens, sleeping rough on our streets. Fewer people can afford their own home, and wages are still lower than they were a decade ago. Productivity is falling, and the economy contracted last month. At the weekend, Mr. Speaker, I was in Hastings on the south coast, where last year food banks, staffed by volunteers, distributed 87,453 meals, and 1 in 7 people in that town live in fuel poverty. Are those not shocking figures in this country in the 21st century? There was nothing in the Queen's speech to address our stagnant economy, nothing to address low pay and insecure work, nothing to reverse the rising levels of child poverty or of pensioner poverty. So,
Go on, Seymour. Go on, Seymour.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me as well that the challenges now faced by rising child poverty, compounded by mental health issues that young people face, compounded by the rising special educational needs not being met by the resources that our education system needs, are contributing to a next generation growing up in despair, which the country will pay the price of for generations to come?
I thank my friend for that intervention. We have almost a lost generation. Children going to school, understaffed schools, very few teaching assistants, head teachers going out with a begging bowl to parents to try to match the school budget, and too many young people growing up in incredible levels of stress, of bad housing, and of stress and worry about the future. That contributes to the mental health crisis that this country as a whole must address. So, will the Prime Minister match Labour's commitments to scrap the benefit freeze, end the benefit cap, ditch the bedroom tax, scrap the 2-child limit and the disgusting rape clause, and end punitive sanctions in the benefit system? Whilst, Mr. Speaker, we welcome the legislation to ensure employers pass on tips to their workers, something the Labour and trade union movement has long campaigned for, the government must go further, and I would urge them to listen to the package of measures set out by my honourable friend, the member for North West Durham, when she made a brilliant speech at the TUC earlier last month. This speech, Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech today was supposed to herald an end to austerity and a new vision. Instead, it barely begins to unpick the devastating cuts to public services. The National Health Service, yes, it will give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. Would he agree that the climate and nature emergencies demand so much more than just the 6 words they were recorded in the speech, and an environment bill that will widely weaken the protections we currently enjoy as members of the EU? And would he join me in calling for a comprehensive Green New Deal to decarbonise the economy by 2030 so we can show we're genuinely serious about the climate crisis?
I thank the member for that intervention. I am coming on to that in a moment, but I absolutely agree with her. What we need is a Green New Deal, we need a green industrial revolution, and we have to face up to the reality of the climate emergency. If we don't, the damage to the next generation and the one after that will be even worse. Our National Health Service has suffered the longest funding squeeze in its history, and life expectancy is falling and infant mortality is rising. Schools have had their budgets cut, class sizes have risen, and head teachers are sending begging letters to parents. Any member opposite who's concerned about that should simply take a walk down the road and speak to any primary school head teacher about the stress they're going through and the stress their pupils are going through. The police have lost over 20,000 officers whilst violent crime soars.
The gentleman for giving way. Would he therefore support this government's policy to rapidly increase school funding?
Well, if only they were, it would be a good thing.
They chopped it for 10 years.
All the off-the-cuff announcements by the Prime Minister since July do not add up to the austerity created by that party and by the Liberal Democrats during their period in coalition. Mr. Speaker, NHS England has made clear that core treatment targets cannot be met within the funding settlement offered by the government. They cannot be trusted with the National Health Service. Waiting lists are going up, waiting times are going up, and the shortage of GPs continues to create problems at every doctor's surgery. The government's refusals to guarantee key standards lets down the 4.4 million patients on the waiting list, all those waiting longer and longer in excellent emergency departments, and nearly 34,000 patients who waited over 62 days for cancer treatment last year.
Shameful.
With 40,000 nurse vacancies, there is an urgent need to restore the nurse bursary so we have the nurses of tomorrow. But if the Prime Minister really wants to defend it, Mr. Speaker, if the Prime Minister really wants to defend the NHS, he needs to end privatisation so that our NHS is focused on making people better, not people on the make. A universal service free at the point of use. We don't just want tinkering around the edges. We want to bin the Health and Social Care Act and truly end all privatisation within our National Health Service.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. He talks about the bursary system. I trained on the bursary system and lived on a pittance each month. It's this government that's introducing degree nurse apprenticeships when the student nurses...
Well, I've got news for her. It's her government that ended the nurse bursary system. Simple. So, will the Prime Minister support Labour's plans to provide free prescriptions to people in England, as has been done in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland? And will he back Labour's commitment to legislate for safe staffing levels in all our hospitals? In the last Queen's speech in 2017, it stated, and I quote, my government will reform mental health legislation and ensure that mental health is prioritised in the National Health Service in England. 2 years on, all we have are the same warm words. The mental health crisis continues to get worse and worse as many people in great stress are told there is no therapy available to them for several months, and as a result, terrible things can happen. It's a similar story, Mr. Speaker, on social care. The 2017 Queen's Speech promised, and I quote, "My ministers will work to improve social care and will bring forward proposals." Today, we have the same promise after 2 years of inaction and failure, with 87 people dying every day while they wait for social care that is not provided. This Queen's Speech is shockingly weak on education, with no commitment on early years, on colleges or on universities. The money announced for our schools does not restore the funding lost since 2010. It's all very well, Mr. Speaker, promising extra police, but the reason we don't have enough police is because the government cut 21,000 police jobs and nearly 7,000 police community support officers. And if the party opposite, the party in government, wants to talk about providing police with protections, perhaps they can tell the police why they subjected them and millions of other public sector workers to cuts in their pay, their pensions and damaging their terms and conditions of employment. I know this government doesn't have a great record of listening to judges, but surely they are aware that judges already have the powers to ensure that the most serious offenders serve more than half of their sentences in jail. Our prisons are severely overcrowded. There are 2,500 fewer prison officers in our prisons today than in 2010. Hence, many of the problems throughout our prison service. The privatisation of the probation service was a shambolic and costly failure. And I hope that lessons have been learned and we'll examine closely any proposals on rehabilitating offenders. Because I hope that alongside the tougher sentencing, the government will also recognise that too many people are in prison on very short sentences for non-violent and non-sexual offences. Our society, I believe, could be better served by them being subject to community sentencing and restorative justice. And what will the Prime Minister do to address the appalling low conviction rate for rape and other serious sexual offences? The dog whistle rhetoric around foreign offenders, Mr. Speaker, is a rather ugly mask for the fact that by crashing out of the EU, this government risks losing some of the most effective measures in tackling cross-border crime. The European arrest warrant, participation in Eurojust and access to numerous databases. We will, of course, study the detail closely of the government's proposals on rail reform. But it's no good simply changing the way in which train operating companies carry on extracting profit from our fragmented railway system. Only a Labour government will cap fares and ensure the railway is run for the passengers, not for profit. And there's nothing in this Queen's Speech to reverse the devastating cuts to bus services all over the country. It's a Labour government that will restore rail and bus services and the integration of those services. Mr. Speaker, 2 years ago, the horror of Grenfell happened. We all remember it very well, and we remember the response of the public and in this House. But I have to say, 9 out of 10 private blocks of flats with Grenfell-style cladding still have not had it replaced. Not a single private block has been made safe under this Prime Minister. So will he confirm today that he will set a hard deadline for all landlords to replace dangerous cladding, that he will toughen sanctions against block owners that won't do that work, and will fund the retrofitting of sprinklers in all high-rise social housing blocks, and restore the budget cuts to our fire service, who acted so heroically on that dreadful night of the Grenfell fire. And perhaps he can set out what measures there are to address this government's abject failure on housing that's led to more people sleeping on our streets, more families in hostels and in temporary accommodation, and fewer people able to buy their own home. Labour will end no-fault evictions. We will tackle the leasehold scandal and kickstart the largest council house building programme for a generation. It will be Labour that will fix the housing crisis in this country. The introduction of pension dashboards is welcome, as is the legislation for CDC pension schemes, which I hope will help resolve the Royal Mail dispute. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, these proposals do nothing to address the injustice done to women born in the 1950s. That injustice must be put right. And this Queen's speech additionally does nothing to guarantee the free TV licence for the over 75s. This government, Mr. Speaker, handed our armed forces a pay cut for 7 years, and cuts to council budgets in England have made it far harder to deliver the Armed Forces Covenant, leaving our veterans, our personnel and all of their families worse off. We will not allow this government to stifle democracy by making it harder for people to vote. There was only one instance of voter personation in the last election. 11 million people in this country don't have... It's serious. It's about elections and it's about democracy. 11 million people in this country don't have a passport or a driving licence. There are huge risks in the legislation being proposed, which will disproportionately affect working class, ethnic minority and young voters.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way on that point. Does he agree with me that this decision to require voters to have photo ID at the ballot box is clearly an attempt by the party opposite to suppress voting, particularly, Mr. Speaker, designed deliberately to hit the poorest hardest.
There is no question, Mr. Speaker, and my friend is absolutely right. This legislation is designed to hit the poorest the hardest, those that don't have passport, don't have access to other identity, and will thus lose their right to vote and decide who governs in the future. Freedom.
Order. The right honourable gentleman will give way when he chooses. He doesn't need to be told what to do by people gesticulating at him. Stop it. It's low grade, down market and out of keeping with the code. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, freedom of movement has given opportunities to millions of British people to live, to work and to retire across Europe. And it has benefited our economy absolutely immensely, with European Union workers playing a key role in sustaining many of our industries and our public service. No responsible member would vote to rip that up unless there is a proper plan in place. In the shadow of the Windrush scandal, the settled status scheme for European Union citizens risks another round of wrongful denial of rights and shameful deportations. I look forward to the Prime Minister assuring those European Union citizens that have made such an enormous contribution to our lives and our society that they will have a secure future in this country. The government says that it will be at the forefront of solving the most complex international security issues and global challenges. And yet they're playing precisely no role in stopping the horrors unfolding in the Kurdish areas of northern Syria. ending the war and humanitarian crisis in Yemen, or standing up for the rights of the Rohingya, the Uyghurs, or the people of Palestine, Ecuador, or Hong Kong. They're continuing to cosy up to Donald Trump and sitting idly by as he wrecks the world's efforts to tackle climate change and nuclear proliferation. As the member for Brighton said on an intervention, the crisis of our age, Mr. Speaker, is the climate emergency, as declared by this House in May. But there is no action announced in this Queen's speech. So, Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the climate school strikers and to Extinction Rebellion. Sadly, the government hasn't listened. The Prime Minister derided them as nose-ringed crusties, although I note their number included a Conservative former member of the European Parliament, who I believe is related to the Prime Minister. So many people are concerned, Mr. Speaker, about bad air quality, the failure to invest in renewable energy and the pollution of our rivers and seas and the loss of biodiversity. But only this government has the power and resource to tackle the climate emergency if it wanted to, but is missing with inaction. It's Labour that will bring forward a Green New Deal to tackle the climate emergency. The legislative programme, Mr. Speaker, is a propaganda exercise that the government cannot disguise. This government has failed on Brexit for over 3 years. They're barely beginning to undo the damage of a decade of cuts to our public services. It does nothing for people struggling to make ends meet, does nothing to make our world a safer place or tackle the climate emergency. The Prime Minister promised that this Queen's speech would dazzle us. On closer inspection, Mr. Speaker, it is nothing more than fool's gold.